Great. Thank you, Keith, and good morning. Keith, you said blue sky thinking, and that's exactly what I've tried to do today. The title you gave me was Growing a Sustainable Economy, Creating a Fairer Society, and Visions for the Future, which is, in my speak as a scientist, as I was originally a scientist, a bit like life, the universe, and everything, but unfortunately the answer isn't 42. So what I'm going to do today is canter through just some thoughts very quickly, and I'm sorry if the slides are going to be flicked at you quite quickly. It's more the impression I'm going to create rather than the detail. I think it's very important to start off with is that it's very easy for us to think that this is just about Scotland and it's a local issue. I think we have to look at this as a global issue. It's not just about Scotland, the UK, or even Europe. It's about what's happening around the rest of the world. So what I'm going to look at is, first of all, more of a global perspective, how that translates into a UK-Scottish perspective. And then, I'm afraid to say I'm going to give you my vision, or Reform Scotland's vision, and see how that impacts onto both a fairer society and the economy. I want to start by saying that I don't know how many of you remember your grandparents talking to you and really believing in the whole idea of empire and colony, and thinking at the time how quaint and old-fashioned that is. I fully expect our grandchildren to think how quaint and old-fashioned it is to talk about nationalism and nationhood and patriotism in the same way as colonies and empire. And I think the first thing is to recognize that we are in a paradigm, and a paradigm that I believe is changing. This first slide shows that the increase in the global economy has massively outstripped the increase in the world's economy. So the global trade, global trade, which is this here, is massively outstripping GDP. And the reason for that, I believe, is twofold. Most paradigm changes comes from a change in technology. And we've seen two huge technologies that have really changed the whole way the world works. The first is the massive transfer of international data. And this chart here just shows you how the growth of the internet has happened really in the last 10 years. So you can see back here at the end of the 90s, even in the developed world, only 10% of us was really using the internet. We're now, 10 years later, up at 64%, and the figure for 2014 is 77%. Worldwide, we're also seeing the 25% there is already at 37%. We're seeing a massive increase in a data transfer. And if you go to the slide before, the reason the projections are going up so quickly is that we are becoming increasingly more global. The second factor, and just one more slide to look at that, this is a slide of the increase in data transfer around the world, and you can see that compared to mobile data is, if I look at this, the huge exponential curve that's happening in the last 3 or 4 years in how data is being transferred around the world. I don't think any of us, I'd find it difficult for people to argue that we're not becoming a more global society. And the second thing that's radically changing it is how goods and people are shipped around the world. And this just shows you the real increase, again, coming in 2000, of this leap upwards. This particular one is air freight. But you can see the same with passenger numbers or sea freight, the massive increase there is in global distribution of product. I think the other factor that goes along this, which is perhaps a strange one, is at the same time we're seeing increased globalization, we're also seeing a real move to localization. I could produce many examples of this, but the one that actually caught my fancy is the following. This one shows the number of homes that are actually producing their own energy, either as a single dwelling or a multi-purpose dwelling. And again, an exponential increase in people taking responsibility for areas that were much more centralized before. So you can see that the number of homes looking after their own energy needs is expanding and projected to increase at an exponential rate. If you put these two policies together, increased globalization and increased localization, you get to a terrible term called localism. The reason it's a terrible term is it was invented, funnily enough, by McDonald's to describe a completely global franchise, but where supposedly each outlet has a choice in its own menu and its own style and how it delivers the product to the end customer. I'm not sure how many of us can differentiate between the burgers here or in France, but the concept was done by them. And what it's a reflection of is our current paradigm is a highly centralized one. And we recognize this in the UK around our capital city, in that it's not just in government, but in all forms of business and commerce and public sector, is that we get a system like this on the left where everything nodes into a central point. I believe that if we're moving towards localism, we will see an increased decentralization towards a point where there are many nodes and the center becomes decentralized and is more of a coordinating entity. And the ultimate conclusion of this is a networked environment where one goes to the far right and everyone talks to each other on relatively equal terms. In fact, the internet is the perfect example of this in itself, in that what the internet allows us to do is have a global language that is controlled by a global organization, W3C, and at the same time, it allows us to speak globally. You as individuals can control the type of computer you have, the information that you want, the services that you buy from it, the software that you choose to put on it. So it gives you real local control, but within a truly global network. Now, will localism lead to more global equality? And the answer is the jury's still out. But one thing that's quite interesting, I don't know how many of you are aware of the Gini index, but it's an index that measures the relative difference between a society where one person holds all the wealth and nobody holds anything, and everyone has it equally shared. If you look at the world's Gini index, you can see that the corporate period of the 80s and 90s to here were really where the Gini index took off, and inequality, the higher this goes, the more inequality there is, really reached its peak at the end of the 90s. There is, seemingly, a shift now towards greater equality globally, and that's a good thing. It's too early, perhaps, to tell whether it's a long-term shift or not. So that's the first proposal, is I believe the new paradigm is going to be about localism. Increased globalization with increased localization. More of an hourglass than a pyramid. How does this affect the public sector? Well, apart from religion, the public sector is probably the slowest of any organization to change to a paradigm, partly because you have the ingrained power yourself. No one wants to give up power, and nations don't really want to give up power. Paradigm shifts can be very dangerous. But I think what the public sector is realizing is to control the increasing rise of globalism, things that are global in nature, like banking, like regulation, like control of corporate taxes, environment, terrorism, alleviation of disaster and poverty reliefs, needs to be done at a global level, which is why organizations like NATO, UN, the World Health Organization, World Bank, are increasingly growing in their influence. At the same time, we're seeing a real move towards decentralization. Henry was saying that many countries now can totally accept the transfer of powers to a much more local level. And you can see from this graph here, whereas UK and Scotland is in the 90% club, where 90% of revenues are collected centrally, many other countries are already moving towards, progressively, local areas, whether that's local government or even further down, communities, raising much more of their taxation, which is a sign of decentralization. And I think the Scandinavian model that people look at is not necessarily one about left of center or right of center. The real thing about the Scandinavian model is that they go down, countries really around about the same equivalent size of Scotland, they go down to community levels of 300, which take real responsibility. 300 communities in Norway, 300 communities in Denmark, who really take a decentralized approach. And they're looking at how that produces both efficiency in the economy and the public sector, but also looking at the fairness of it. Because I think what's interesting in terms of fairness is this graph here, which shows the top 20% versus the bottom 20%. So the Scandinavian countries, which you look up here, Finland, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, the richest 20% are 4 times richer than the bottom 20%. But if you look at the UK over here, you see something where it's almost seven times and the US 8 times. And they're looking to see how that decentralization community effect can create perhaps a fairer society. And the advantage of decentralization is about choice and individualization. It's about giving people back the powers to do things. A great mistake, I think, is for people to constantly feel that decentralization will lead to this race to the bottom in competition. And I came across this really interesting chart, which I thought, to me, describes it very well. You can't read any of it, but this is the top 50, this is the 50 states in the US and how they raise their taxes. So it's out of 100. And you can see all the brown area that you see to the left here is taxes raised through sales tax. The cream areas are taxes raised through property, and the green areas are taxes raised through income. So you can see an amazing difference. So you take at the top something like Oregon, which raises no general sales tax, which is the dark brown, but most of it in income tax, compared to its next door state, Nevada, which has no income tax and raises most through property tax. It doesn't mean those two economies have performed particularly differently. They've been enabled to do it in their own way, which has delivered a better result for their own type of economy and their own type of society that they want to create. So, I've done the global bit. Hopefully I've got 10 minutes left to do how that looks at when you compare it to Scotland. The UK today is facing localism. At the same time that Westminster is facing ceding more powers to Europe, which it's trying to resist, and ceding more powers to NATO, it's also looking at how it copes with devolution. Earlier this week, we did a report looking at all 5 parties and their proposals on what would happen after September. It's published, it's on our website, reformscotland.com. I've done a quick summary of it, because it's 80 pages long, and I thought that some interesting trends emerge from it. The left-hand box here is the status quo, so it's in white. Anything in green is a change from the current system. So you can see, quite interestingly from this, that actually the party of greatest change is the Green Party, who really want for us to come out of NATO, to come out of Europe, to have our own currency, to not have those controls. They are really the party of decentralization. They want things to be pushed all the way down to a local level, and they're very strong on local issues. The SNP, apart from wanting self-determination, which actually most of the country probably doesn't understand what self-determination means, actually is remarkably similar to the other unionist parties in that they want a monetary union. They recognize that 70% of our trade is with the rest of the UK. They want to be part of Europe generally. They want to be part of NATO and these larger organizations. And actually the other 3 unionist parties, apart from the Conservatives here, all want to see the Scottish Parliament enshrined in a permanent legislative parliament rather than can be taken away by the whim of Westminster. When you come to welfare powers, oddly enough, all but the Liberal Democrats now are suggesting that we should have more welfare powers. The Conservatives and Labour are talking about housing benefit and welfare controls, whereas obviously independents will bring full control. And interestingly enough, when it comes to local government, the only people that haven't really, in a rather large 650-page submission, really talked about more powers for local government has been the SNP, because all the others recognise a decentralising approach. So, very interestingly, I put this slide out 2 years ago, which actually said, this is not about independence, this is about the parties coming together into the centre. And Henry McLeish mentioned earlier that there was a suggestion of a third option. I also very much supported that third option, because I think that's where the public were. The public were in a position where they want to see a union with certain of the global issues like monetary policy and defense handled at a more global level with more weight. But they also recognize this decentralization, that if devolution is going to work, you need all the tools in one place. You need the tax powers and the welfare powers, and that doesn't need to stop at Holyrood and make Holyrood another Westminster. It needs to go all the way down to local government as well. So, what's our vision? We set out 3 years ago a proposal called Devo Plus. And Devo Plus, it has a definite philosophy. And the philosophy of Devo Plus is once you decide what each level of government should be responsible for, then that level of government should have all the welfare, fiscal, and spending powers, by and large, to carry that out, which would mean passing down enough tax and welfare powers, both to Holyrood and local government, to allow them to take holistic approaches to what they want to do with the responsibilities and the services that they want to deliver. Housing benefit. If local government is control of housing, why shouldn't it have housing benefit controls? Why shouldn't it raise the taxes for housing benefit? Why shouldn't it be allowed, Glasgow, to be allowed to do housing in the way it wants to do, rather than Edinburgh, which may want to do it in a different way? So we're proposing that currently these benefits would be passed down to a Scottish, a Holyrood level, and also further down to local government level. And we're also proposing that if you take the current system, these taxes here would be passed down. So the current tax take in Scotland, which is raised in Scotland, controlled in Scotland, is 10 billion, would go to 33 billion, which represents about 73% of what is spent in Scotland is raised in Scotland. So the question everyone then asks is, well, is this all affordable? You know, do the numbers work? And if you take the current taxes and look at how it's broken down, it's really just reshifting the tools. This is the latest GERS figures. If you reshift how they work, the taxes we've proposed would mean that Scotland would get 37 billion, the UK would raise for Scotland 19 billion, UK would be responsible for 18 billion of expenditure, Scotland 46. Scotland would get its fair share of borrowing per head basis because it pays the interest on the debt and it helps with the share of that. And actually on this set of figures, Scotland would get a marginal benefit from that because actually its share of debt, given its deficit was slightly lower, would mean it would get a bit of a benefit. But as the deficit closed, or the rest of the UK did better, that deficit would close. Yesterday, we made a press announcement, and that was to say that if you take Devo Plus and you compare it to the best bits of what all the three unionist parties are saying, you actually get very close. The worst bits, and most politicians tend to go to the lowest common denominator, not the most progressive one, the worst bit would give us 5p extra in income tax, which is be all use to anyone. But the best bits would give you something that really does look really very exciting about decentralization. You would have decentralization of government, you would have control over housing benefits and some aspects of welfare benefits like the job seekers allowance. In terms of taxes, what I've done here is say, if you add all their taxes up, and of the three unionist parties on the most progressive way, you get out to nearly 70%, which actually is a real devolvement of power. And when you compare it with the independents, you get to 81%, because of course the deficit makes up the remaining 19%. Likewise, if you take Indy Light and you take what the SNP want here, together with what the Greens want on local government, the two proposals, rather than being head-on-head, are getting remarkably close in what we might see after September. So just to leave you, whether we get a yes vote or whether we get a no vote, I think we have to take into account that this is going to be a continual progression because we are in a global world. And not only are we fighting with this, but people are looking at Scotland as a model for how this localism is going to work in future. And I think it's up to us to see and explore how we can create a model that really works in the middle, that creates something that communities and local government feel empowered to do the public services that they want in a recognition that we're in an increasingly global world. Thank you.